Good afternoon. The title of my talk is Rethinking Globalization. It is a deliberate play on the title of the journal Rethinking Marxism, which has brought us together not only this afternoon, but also for this fourth in a series of international conferences. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. Sure, I don't care. All right. I want to thank the conference organizing committee for inviting me to participate in this plenary session. I am indeed honored, and for doing all of the work necessary to plan, pull together, produce, and move the mic for this conference. I want to publicly recognize the role of the members of the committee, as well as that of many others who have raised money, designed and distributed posters, assembled the program, made local arrangements, and joined together in a collective work project to put together this vibrant and diverse gathering of students, scholars, artists, and activists. I think we deserve for them another round of thanks. Now on to the topic at hand. Let me state up front that I am worried about the ubiquity of the term globalization in our current thinking. In general, the uses of the term suggest that there is something fundamentally new happening in the world, that a more or less complete reorganization of culture, politics, and economics is taking place on both the right and the left, in both mainstream and alternative analyses. But for this afternoon, for the next half hour, is a set of understandings of globalization on the left that I am most concerned about. As much as they have mobilized large numbers of people in demonstrations against the current forms of governance of the world economy, I worry about the ways in which many on the left have rushed to accept the existence of globalization, to invoke it, to explain everything that is happening in the world, to slide over or forego concepts and modes of analysis that have long defined the Marxian tradition, to foreclose other ways of seeing and acting in the world. Most uses of the term globalization assert that something fundamentally new characterizes the world today. Let me suggest, however, that the forms of global economic integration that we are witnessing today are at least quantitatively not so different from those of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the period between, say, 1870 and 1913. Let me list three of the salient facts of this earlier period, because as I have learned, at least at Notre Dame, everything comes in threes. From the 1860s onwards, export growth and rising foreign trade shares were stimulated by the widening and deepening of capitalist relations, along, of course, with breakthroughs in long-distance transportation, such as steamships, and communications, especially the telegraph. Thus, for example, the growth of international trade averaged 3.5% per annum, compared with output growth of 2.7%. 1. 2. The international economy was characterized by large and relatively stable capital flows, based on the spread of the gold standard convertible currencies and the financial hegemony of Great Britain. During the 1870 to 1913 period, the growth of portfolio investment exceeded the growth of trade, foreign direct investment, and output. In fact, by 1913, the volume of international capital flows had reached 5% of the gross national product of the capital exporting countries. Third, production was also internationalized during this earlier period as foreign direct investment increased, the stock of which reached 9% of world output by 1913, a figure that has not been reached even today. In other words, the activities of international trade, finance, and production were evolving rapidly, if of course unevenly, from 1870 to 1913, and the levels in all of these areas today have generally not surpassed the earlier ones. Globalization new? At the same time, we should not overstate the similarities between the two periods. I really do want it both ways. There are new features within the most recent forms of globalization. For example, while the trade structures of both periods are characterized by a strong north-south orientation, The colonial regimes of the late 19th century meant that many regions of Latin America, Africa, and Asia were forced to have the freedom to specialize in raw materials exports and manufacturing imports. This led to a deindustrialization of the South, whose share in global manufacturing production fell from 1/3 to less than 1/10 during that period. Today, the internationalization of economic activity has been accompanied by a reindustrialization of the Third World and a decline in the share of manufacturing activity in the North. Other new developments within the contemporary global economy compared to this 1870 to 1913 period include, one, clearly a growth in the number, size, and global reach of transnational corporations, the internationalization of service sector activities such as marketing, banking and finance, insurance, hotels and tourism, health, and telecommunications, which, like transnational corporations themselves, did play a role in the earlier period, but their recent internationalization has far outpaced that of other sectors. The speed of capital flows around the world, and the role of short-term capital movements especially, as national financial markets have been deregulated and new international financial instruments invented. The list of changes within the world economy, in other words, could go on. My point is that concentrating exclusively on either what is new or what is old can only lead to errors for Marxist thinkers and activists. We need to pay attention to the current conjuncture for points of rupture, new challenges, and new possibilities, but we don't need to accept the wholesale movement to globalization as an absolutely new phenomenon. It is the rush to globalization that, in my view at least, leaves us trapped in sterile debates. For example, between a truly global economy versus the continued relevance of nation states, international organizing versus national level politics, free trade versus regulated trade, and so on. The result is to limit our conceptions of the possible. In the hands of many left-wing economists, almost said communists, in the hands of many left-wing economists, for example, progressive economic policy is reduced to a project of national and international economic regulation, as if encouraging economic growth and productive capital accumulation and discouraging speculative financial investment did not also provide some of the conditions of existence of capitalist exploitation. How and when did left political economy become confined to the choice between different patterns of capitalist development? If the terms of the existing debates concerning globalization are not ours, even less so is the inclination to invoke the economy as a demiurge, propelling all other elements of society to some endpoint, whether utopia or dystopia. Too much has been done, including in the pages of Rethinking Marxism and elsewhere, with the aim of recovering the non-economistic elements of Marxism to return to such traditional formulations. The critique of political economy is, among other things, a critique of this economizing tendency. Finally, the focus on globalization has displaced other concepts or ways of making sense of the world. I'm thinking in particular of the notion of imperialism. Historically, let's remember that imperialism refers both to what Edward Said calls the age of classical imperialism and to the configuration of conditions that Lenin referred to as the highest stage of capitalism. Exactly the time period that can be characterized by a process of internationalization or globalization that, at least quantitatively, is very similar to our own. So if we want to argue that the concept of imperialism held at least some validity for that time, what fundamentally has changed to all but eliminate its use today? Not that the exact definitions need apply as theoreticians deployed it, or as it emerged in the writings of novelists at the time, as Edward Said has so remarkably shown. Today, of course, such formal empires no longer exist, precisely because the thinkers and movements of anti-imperialism and national liberation, from Mariátegui and Gandhi to Fanon and Che, from Peru and India to Algeria and Cuba, were successful, because imperialism was opposed both by broad alliances of subaltern colonized peoples and by equally broad alliances within the imperial nations themselves. The results were not always what we or they had hoped, but since when as Marxists have we ever expected purity or finality in the real concrete processes of history in the making? But for all that, we are witnesses today to events and activities that can only be understood in terms of some notion of imperialism, and that could only be opposed by sustained, broad, anti-imperialist intellectual and political work. How else to understand the wars in the Gulf and Kosovo? Are such massive military interventions so far away from the invasions of Grenada and Panama, or the support for the Contras in Honduras, or the efforts to establish NAFTA and the WTO, and the activities of the World Bank and the IMF? No, these do not involve a political or economic carving up of the world, not exactly. It's not individual parts of the world, but the world as a whole. A project to recolonize the entire world, to remake it with the zeal of a humanizing mission precisely reminiscent of civilization, Christianity, and commerce, the theme that, according to the legendary David Livingstone, was the basis of the European colonization of Africa. Today, for the imperial presidencies of Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Gore to come, the mission can be summed up as democracy, anti-communism, and free trade. Wherein then resides the resistance to invoking imperialism to characterize and oppose at least some significant events and activities, frameworks and projects in the world today? Let me venture at least a couple of reasons why there may be such resistance and respond, if only briefly, to each in turn. One may be the messiness of recent military interventions, for example, the Gulf War. George Bush versus Saddam Hussein? One of the most discouraging personal episodes of that war was watching my liberal and even left-wing colleagues become supporters of U.S.-led smart bomb alliance to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. It was never a question of choosing between the two, but of opposing the war itself based on an understanding of the history that gave rise to both the invasion of Kuwait and the effort of the United States to obliterate Hussein, the failed negotiations, the massacre on the highway, and so on. The fact that the victims of aggression are never so innocent should not prevent us from understanding and opposing the institutions, practices, and projects that constitute imperialism. A second reason may be the association of globalization with the universalization of capitalism. While imperialism is traditionally referred to the relationship between capitalism and non-capitalism, the colonization of one by the other. However, it's a mistake, I think, to assume that because capitalism has become global, was there ever a time when it was not? All forms of non-capitalism have been eliminated, or that they can simply be ignored in the economic and social landscape. So, the historical similarities between then and now constitute one reason to support the idea of recovering imperialism to understand what is taking place in the world. Another reason to deploy the concept of imperialism has to do with its effects, its performativity, if you will. Imperialism, different from globalization, refers to a multidimensional set of practices with no necessary unity or inevitability about them. They may and often do work together, but with no singular purpose or organizing entity. They are set in motion, and they can be resisted and alternatives devised. Globalization, on the other hand, has a depressing inevitability about it. And that's because it is configured as an unfolding of an economic logic. Globalization is gigantic and apocalyptic. Imperialism, on the other hand, is partial and incomplete. Less a description of an entire stage of capitalism or world development than a project in that world, an attempt to make and remake that world. I think then imperialism shares these features with another venerable Marxist concept, exploitation. There's nothing inevitable about exploitation, either in general or in its specific forms, capitalist, feudal, slave, individual, and so on. Exploitation, or in its capitalist form, the extraction of labor from labor power, the self-expansion of value, is a process, one among many within the social totality. Qua exploiters, the boards of directors of capitalist enterprises appropriate the surplus value produced by the laborers within those enterprises. This surplus is in turn distributed to merchants, bankers, the state, other capitalists, stockholders, and so on, who provide some of the economic, political, and cultural conditions under which that exploitation continues to take place. Such distributions of surplus labor profoundly shape the social and natural environment within which we live. What we call capitalism, then, is that constellations of conditions and effects that are associated, not inevitably or uniformly, but contingently and historically, with the extraction of surplus labor in the form of surplus value. Imperialism, in turn, is the set of conditions that shape and are shaped by the existence of this exploitation. Yes, capitalist imperialism. Not because capitalism always get what they want, nor because forms of colonial expansion did not predate the emergence and development of capitalism, nor finally because capitalism can be reduced to or explained entirely in terms of the economy or class. I wouldn't want to. But because the particular forms of imperialism I am referring to, from the British annexation of India to the U.S. military barrage on Iraqi forces and the ongoing embargo against the Iraqi people, cannot be divorced from these complex changing conditions and effects of capitalism. And that's as true in the metropolitan centers as in the southern periphery. Moreover, these conditions and effects can be felt throughout society, in culture, politics, and economics. But let me stay with the economics for this afternoon, leaving the remainder not because they are any less important to those with more expertise than I, especially my fellow panelists. As I see it, we need to understand both the economic dimensions of contemporary imperialism and the role of economic discourse in constituting imperialism. That is, no less than the novels, movies, and other cultural artifacts analyzed by literary and cultural critics, economic discourse plays an important role with the imperial frame of contemporary capitalism. I want to attempt to describe in this brief talk the myriad international economic activities that we witness today. Let me focus instead on the class dimensions of one activity, subcontracting to foreign sweatshops. This one example gives us a sense of the complex class dynamics and forms of anti-imperialist politics that can be and are being carried out. Briefly, in Marxian class terms, the subcontracted sweatshop production of Nike and other transnational manufacturers does not represent foreign exploitation, as is often believed, but rather an exchange relationship in which Nike and other such companies purchase commodities, goods or services from sneakers, other forms of apparel and computer software, to grocery coupon counting and data entry from foreign suppliers. The fact that the purchaser is a capitalist enterprise does not in and of itself tell us the class character of the production that takes place on the other end. And even if the supplier is a capitalist sweatshop, as many, although not all of them are, we do not have any form of foreign exploitation taking place. An important part of the inducement to exploit and to improve, or from the perspective of the laborers, worsen the conditions of exploitation, comes from the attempt to get and maintain the subcontract. But the capitalists of the domestic, in this case, for example, U.S. buyer, do not extract the surplus labor of the laborers within the foreign shop. This makes transnational subcontracting different from the kinds of transnational direct investment in through which foreign exploitation does take place. Not nation by nation, but by the capitalists located in one country who extract the surplus value from laborers working in another country. They are different. What is true is that the imperial machine creates the conditions for both relationships to exist precisely by defining private property rights and opening up markets, reducing tariffs and other so-called barriers to trade, and encouraging the flow of goods and services, whether produced by subsidiaries or by subcontractors, to take place between countries. What are the implications of this class distinction between subcontracting and direct foreign investment? First, as I mentioned before, the subcontracting enterprise need not be a capitalist one. One of the characteristics of markets is precisely the idea that commodities need not be capitalist commodities. Non-capitalist producers can and do sell subcontracted goods and services to capitalists, including the largest transnational capitalist corporations. Second, if and when the subcontractors are capitalist enterprises now, then determining how and when exploitation takes place will depend on the nature of the enterprises. When they are local manufacturers or even multinational subcontractors, which run many sweatshops for Nike and other such multinational buyers, then we have local, or in general foreign capitalists, extracting surplus value from their laborers, not the transnational partner in the United States or elsewhere. What this analysis helps us to do is to challenge the economic or class homogeneity imposed by most uses of the term globalization. The idea, for example, that capitalism has become singular and universal. We can begin instead to see a heterogeneous class landscape, filled with both different forms of capitalism and various types of non-capitalism, in the midst of the global reach of certain capitalist enterprises and free international markets. And yet we can still identify the imperialist project and devise an anti-imperialist political practice. This encourages me, at least, to think of imperialism as a kind of machine, as against either a particular stage of capitalism, that was Lenin's preference, or merely a political choice, the approach of Lenin's nemesis, Kautsky. In contrast, the machine-like quality of capitalism, of imperialism, gives a sense of the ways in which it has various parts that often but do not always work together. A set of energies that propels individuals and groups, institutions and structures to enact designs and to civilize those who attempt to resist its apparent lessons, to make them succumb to the naturalized logic. Not a stage of capitalism, but rather a machine that energizes and is energized by capitalism at various points in its history. Not a mere political choice available to ruling governments and regimes, although it does include various options: military bombardment or occupation, economic carrots and economic sticks, cultural hegemony and worldwide news reach. And the knowledge is produced by economists. Economic analysis, as it is practiced today in the U.S. Academy, think tanks, and government agencies, cannot be maintained apart from the imperial machine that attempts to discipline us as well as them. The disciplinary machine dovetails and works with the imperial machine. Without conducting a detailed history of economic thought, what I am referring to are the elaborate theoretical models and empirical estimations of what is called the Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson theory of comparative advantage and the benefits of free international trade, or the macroeconomists who debate the relative merits of neoclassical and structuralist stabilization and adjustment policies that need to be adopted by third world countries. Countries which are presented in exactly the classed, gendered, and racialized terms that were applied to the subaltern groups of classical imperialism, out of control instead of rationally directed, driven by passions instead of interests, lazy, profligate, in other words, in need of the expert advice of objective, disinterested Harvard, World Bank, and IMF economists. That's the mainstream. And then there's the weak opposition within the discipline, which testifies to the ravages committed in the name of the imperial machine, the increase in poverty and the growing income gap between nations, the swelling of the parking lot for the poor in the cities, the fragility of national economic accounts in the face of international capital flows, and so on, but then limits the political options available by arguing in favor of more regulation of trade and finance, faster growth rates, and more international stability. Our Marxian project is radically different. We need to theorize the imperial machine, reminding ourselves of the complex changing determinations and effects of capitalism's worldwide expansion. And alongside our resolute opposition to imperialism, we also need to formulate and enact our own desires for new non-capitalist class arrangements and forms of globalization. Our own, if you will, full Monty. Thank you.